So welcome everyone to our second Accessibility New York City meetup of 2019. So our typical schedule is to have our meetup on the first Tuesday of every month. We are very excited to have Léonie Watson here today from Bristol, United Kingdom. So we are having our event on a different schedule. That's why we're having two this month, because we're so excited to have her here visiting. It's such a great opportunity. So happy to see a lot of people here. Always be aware for our events. We're going to have the captioning available. So up on the screen with the presentation, we always have CART, communication access, real-time translation. Today we have Mirror by Night from White Coat Captioning providing the captions for us, and so we thank her. Applause. So we always have that at our events. We also have Jolly McPhee here doing our live stream, and so if you're never able to come or unable to come to any of our events, we always live stream the event, thanks to Jolly's work and Jolly, help me out with the proper way to say the new working group. The Accessibility Special Interest Group at the Internet Society. And so we always appreciate being able to have this stream. Any of the talks, if you haven't been here before or you've come back, we have all of the talks from the meetup archived on our YouTube channel. My name is Thomas Logan. I don't think I introduced myself, so I'm one of the organizers here. If you haven't met me, I'd love to meet you after the event. We also have all of our other organizers here today as well. So we have Cameron, Sean, and Tyson in the back. And Tyson is also here, works for Thoughtbot, who is the space that we're in today. So we always say thank you to Thoughtbot for being our event host. We've had a lot of great events here and continue to be appreciative of Thoughtbot for their sponsorship. We also have Level Access and Adobe as sponsors now for our meetup event, and we thank both of those organizations for helping make sure that we can always put on an accessible and inclusive event. With that being said, I think we're now ready just to hand it over to Léonie and learn about the Time Traveler's Guide to Accessibility Mechanics. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Hello, and thank you very much for turning out twice in a month. I hadn't realized this was the case, so it's really very sweet of you all to come along to this talk. My name is Léonie. Until very recently, I worked for the Pastiello Group, known as TPG. Now, I'm proud and somewhat terrified to tell you that I'm the owner of a new company called TetraLogical, working in accessibility, but with a focus on emerging technology like VR, voice assistant applications, as well as some traditional consultancy in accessibility. Today, I'd like to talk to you about accessibility mechanics, the past, the present, and the future, and why it's important for all of us who particularly code for the web to be time travelers, to take the best of the past, the present, and the future to make things as accessible as we possibly can. So, for browser engines, or organizations that are responsible for browser engines, at least in the case of Microsoft until not very much longer. But these will all be familiar to you. They're the applications that are the popular tools, certainly in the Western part of the world, for consuming content on the web. Many of you might also be familiar with the assistive technologies known as screen readers and the ones that run on desktop platforms. If you're not, a screen reader is now available on all common desktop platforms, as well as mobile. So on Windows, there's Narrator that's integrated. On Mac OS, there's VoiceOver that's integrated. On Linux, you can sometimes get Orca integrated if you use the Ubuntu distribution. Otherwise, it's available as a download. And on Windows, you also have the open source free NVDA screen reader and the proprietary JAWS screen reader. And screen readers are pieces of technology that convert what's on screen visually into synthetic speech or refreshable braille, so someone like me who's blind and can't see the screen can understand the content. So let's have a look at the past, and particularly at the relationship between these two things, the browser and the screen reader, because it turns out they actually have a very, very interdependent relationship. What used to happen back in the 90s, when Windows was the only platform that had a screen reader worth its salt, the browser would take an HTML document and it would parse it and it would display it visually. If you included form fields or other things you could interact with, it would provide the necessary interaction. And then the screen reader would come along and do more or less exactly the same thing, completely independently. It would take the HTML and it would parse it. But this time, instead of displaying it visually, it would create something that we now know as the virtual buffer, an alternative version of the HTML document, specifically for the screen reader and the screen reader user to be able to interact with. On the one hand, this was quite useful because it let the browser do what browsers did best, it let the screen reader do what screen readers did best, and in both cases, to do what they thought best for their particular audiences. It did have some fairly fundamental problems, though. When you ask two people to go away and interpret the same piece of information, almost invariably they will disagree on how it should be done. The other problem was that with this particular relationship at the time, if the browser crashed, it took your screen reader out with it, or vice versa. If the screen reader crashed, it took your browser out with it, and pretty much nothing but a reboot would cause things to settle back into happy working mode. So it wasn't a particularly brilliant way for things to happen, but it did do the trick. And it enabled people who used screen reading technology to consume web content in a reasonably useful way.
Heading level 1 using the ARIA current attribute posted in link code things on January 14, 2017. It is common on the web for the current thing in a collection to be highlighted visually, but providing an alternative for screen reader users has often involved something of a hack. The link ARIA current attribute is intended to solve this problem.
So in the 90s, what screen readers used to do for the most part was just to read content pretty much top to bottom, almost like today you would read a text document. There wasn't very much in the way of useful navigation available to screen reader users, or really anything very much other than an ability to read text. By the 2000s, things had started to change, and the browsers had implemented support for things known as the platform accessibility APIs. And the screen readers had begun using these APIs to ask the browser for accessibility information. So instead of going off and doing their own thing separately, the browser now passed the HTML document and produced the visual display and the interaction, and it also made accessibility information available to screen readers when they asked for it. There are platform accessibility APIs on every platform. Windows actually has 3 currently. It has UIA, MSAA, and iAccessible2. The first 2 are its own. The second one is what enables applications like Chrome and Firefox to be accessible. Mac OS has XAPI. Linux also has its own APIs. And these exist within the operating system to let a screen reader ask for accessibility information about pretty much anything that's on screen. So it might see a button on screen and ask the API, give me all the information you've got about this object on the screen, and it will get some useful information in return. When it comes to the browser and the HTML elements that we know all about, there's a lot of that information for free. So for example, if we use something like the main element, the browser will expose a number of different pieces of information about it. It will expose its role, in this case, that it's supposed to represent the main content area of the page. A screen reader will ask the browser when it finds this element, hey, what is this thing? What's its role? What's its purpose? The browser will tell the screen reader, and the screen reader will say something like this to the user.
Main region.
It just announces quite simply to the user that they've hit the region of the page that represents the main content. Something very similar happens with the nav element. The browser says to the screen reader, this element has a role of navigation, and the screen reader can pick that up and tell the user that's what they're dealing with.
Navigation region.
And we can see more of this. If we look at something like the OL element, a number of things happen here. The screen reader can find out from the browser that the OL itself is a list, but the browser is a bit smarter. It counts up the number of list item elements inside the list, and it tells the screen reader how many of them there are. So a screen reader user gets an immediate sense of the fact they're dealing with a list and that it's got 3 items in it.
List of 3 items. 1, do this.
Quiet.
2, do that. 3, do something else.
Thanks.
List end.
So you had the 1, 2, 3 because it's an ordered list, and the screen reader picks that up from the browser. And what you maybe missed at the beginning is that it said list of 3 items. So the screen reader user is immediately aware of the size and quantity of the list that they're dealing with. Headings have the same thing. They have a role of heading that the screen reader can pick up from the browser.
Heading level 1.
And it also picks up the number of the heading through another property that the browser makes available, in this case, the level of the heading in question. It also works with form elements. So, for example, we could take a checkbox, an input with a type of checkbox, and an associated label element using the for and ID attribute pairing. The browser connects up all this information. It associates the label with the input and makes that information available to the screen reader user. Uses the type attribute to tell the screen reader user that they're dealing with a checkbox as opposed to perhaps a radio button or other form of input. And, of course, the screen reader can come along and use all that information to help the user. Maybe. Or not. Okay. What it can do, though, is to tell the user that they're dealing with a checkbox, and as the checkbox is checked, the browser will also send a notification to the screen reader to let you know...
I live in the UK, checkbox not checked. Checked.
that the checkbox had been checked. There we go. Awesome. And so all that information just keeps coming from the browser to the screen reader for the asking. Lastly, I'll take the favorite of all accessibility talks, the button element. And this, unsurprisingly, has a role of button. Something that's a little bit different here is that the text inside the button element provides what's known as the accessible name for the button. This is how the screen reader differentiates one button on the page from any other buttons that might be there. With a bit of luck, this will play. Nope. Or it's going to pause and do what it did before. Hang on, bear with me a second. Okay, no, that's not going to work. Never mind.
Play button.
It's going to do this to me all the way through, isn't it? So we come on now to the present, and things have moved on a bit from the days where we could build, or did build, web technologies websites using only the elements that were prescribed in HTML. For some time now, best part of a decade or more, we've been creating things that don't exist naturally in HTML. We've been inventing controls that we use very routinely in software applications, but we've been inventing them or coming up with creative ways to implement them in the browser context. Tabs and tab panels are a notable example. We've been using mostly div and span elements to do this. We've been using them as our building blocks for the custom UI controls that we create. But there is a bit of a problem. Div and span elements don't have any really useful accessibility information. When the browser sees one, it doesn't convey any information to the screen reader user at all. So if we see
Bold.
something
Italic.
like this toolbar, all the screen reader is aware of is the text inside of the div and span elements. It might be styled to look like a toolbar, might be JavaScripted to behave like one, but as far as the screen reader is concerned, all the browser has given it is just the 2 pieces of text on the page. The rest of it is utterly oblivious to the screen reader. Fortunately, we can do something about that. We can use ARIA, accessible rich internet applications, to polyfill the missing accessibility information when we need it. ARIA 1.1 is the current official recommendation from the W3C. ARIA 1.2 is well on its way to heading down the path to become an official standard. And it gives us a bunch of different attributes that we can use to add accessibility information to things like div and span elements when we need to fill it in. The role attribute has more than 70 different values in the ARIA 1.2 specification. And with the role attribute, we can take something like a div or a span, use the role attribute, and depending on the value we give it, we can fool the browser into thinking that it's a completely different sort of a thing. And there are roles for almost every kind of UI control you can think of, for buttons and radio buttons, for tabs and tab lists, for progress bars and toolbars, for tables, cells, and the list goes on. As I say, pretty much every kind of control and interaction point that you can think of. By now, there is a role in ARIA to let you reproduce that accessibility information. So if you're using a div and a span that doesn't have a role of its own, you can use the role attribute with one of these values to make sure it has the right accessibility role information. There are also 45 or more ARIA prefixed attributes, and these can be used to add different kinds of accessibility information or properties or characteristics. Things like ARIA pressed for buttons, ARIA expanded for things that expand or collapse, ARIA required for things that must be filled in a form, ARIA invalid for those that have been filled in with incorrect information. And so these too we can use when we're creating custom components to fill in the accessibility information that otherwise just wouldn't be there. So we can take, I will say this, a truly terrible example. Please don't ever do this. It does happen in the wild though. A span element pretending to be a button. As it stands at the moment, we take a span element with the word play in the middle to simulate perhaps a play button on a video player. But because there's no accessibility information in the browser, the screen reader's got nothing to go on except for the word play. So we have to set about fixing this particular problem. And we start with the role attribute, and in this case, a value of button. If we add that to our span, the browser in its accessibility tree will now present this piece of HTML as though it were a button. The accessibility tree is the structure that the browser creates to hold all the accessibility information about the elements on a page. It's completely separate to the document object model, the DOM, that we use for interacting with things like scripting. So it's only in the accessibility sense is this thing now pretending or being presented as a button. In every other respect, it's still just a plain old span. We can add in the tab index attribute because one of the other things that a span doesn't do is any form of interaction. You can't focus on it with the keyboard. If you click on it with a mouse, nothing very much happens either. So we start off by using tab index with a value of 0 to make sure that someone using a tab key can focus on the button, which is obviously pretty important if you want to be able to interact with it. We then have to provide the interaction. Developers often are quick to put in the mouse interaction, the mouse functionality, but of course it's important to add in the keyboard functionality as well. The expected behaviors of a button, of course, are to be able to press them with the space or enter key. So the JavaScript that we use to create functionality for the button has to listen for both of those things, for when someone presses the space key or the enter key, and it has to trigger the functionality when either is detected. And so now we have another demo, which is almost certainly not going to work, but if we do all of this, our span should actually behave something like this.
Play button.
Oh, there we go. So we had a play button. Which is pretty much what it says on the tin. It's a button with play as its label, and when activated, it looks like it's pressed. Except, you may have noticed that the screen reader didn't communicate that piece of information. It said there was a button there, but it didn't acknowledge that it was either pressed or unpressed or anything of the sort. The solution in this case comes with one of those ARIA prefixed attributes, the ARIA pressed attribute. And if we add that to the button, with a value of false initially, the screen reader will now determine that it's a slightly different kind of button. It's a toggle button, i.e. one that can be toggled on or off. And as someone either hits it with the enter key, space key, mouse, taps on it, we toggle that value to ARIA pressed equals true, and the browser will now let the screen reader know that that button is currently in the pressed state. We can then actually tie in the functionality of the button into that attribute. So we can make sure that as someone interacts with the button, the value of the ARIA pressed attribute is changed appropriately. Toggles on, toggles off, toggles to true, toggles to false. Something nice you can do if you're building something like this is actually attach that functionality and the CSS together. So if you make the CSS change the visual of appearance based on the value that the ARIA pressed attribute has, you get quite a neat effect. It's particularly useful if you are wanting to bug fix your code. A lot of accessibility, particularly the accessibility that we use to help screen reader users in ARIA, is invisible if you're developing. Unless you're testing it with a screen reader, you don't notice all of the accessibility things that are going on with the browser and the screen reader. But if you tie the visual appearance into the ARIA state, if you press your button and it doesn't look like it's been pressed, the first place you need to go looking is your accessibility information to see if the ARIA pressed attribute is in the state it should be. So it's a useful way to hook things together a little bit more usefully into a visual paradigm as well as an accessibility one. What we do with this now is we get a slightly different experience for the screen reader user. Fingers crossed.
Play toggle button not pressed. Pressed. Not pressed.
So now it's announced as a toggle button, as I mentioned, but also the current state of the button is communicated by the browser to the screen reader, whether it's pressed or not pressed. So now we've got a much more complete experience compared to the visual experience or the mouse user's experience. The one thing I will note, because it's just the way things are, rather than doing all that tab indexing and JavaScripting around, we'd all be much better off if we just used the ARIA pressed attribute on the button element. If we use the button element, we get the keyboard focus for free. We only have to provide the JavaScript for the mouse because the browser will hook it into the keyboard interaction for you automatically. We don't have to worry about the role equals button either. The only thing we have to add in is ARIA pressed to get that state change information. So fewer moving parts, much less prone to breaking. So using the button element is always much better than trying to fake it with a span. We also, now in the present day, are moving into an area where web components and custom elements are becoming more and more popular. One of the leading energy suppliers, British Gas, in the United Kingdom, has just released a brand new version of its homepage that's almost entirely populated with web components and custom elements. So this is technology that is now increasingly hitting production mainstream. If you're not familiar with it, a custom element is an element that does something that doesn't exist natively in HTML. So we can create elements that do things that we haven't previously been able to do unless it was by using div and span elements and a whole bunch of scripting and ARIA to make things work. So we start off and we extend the button element. In this case, we're going to extend HTML elements to create something called a T button or a toggle button. And we can put that together. There's a point in the code where you attach something known as the shadow root. That may not be a familiar term to you, but for those of you who are developers, you'll be more familiar with the concept than you might think. Where you use something like the audio or video element, we just literally put open video element, give it a source, close the video element. But when someone views it in the browser has obligingly populated the page with all the buttons and sliders and other controls that you need to be able to play, pause, change the volume, change the incremental timer, all of those things. We don't have to do that as developers. The browser takes care of it. And that's the basic concept of a shadow root. What we put in the HTML actually has much more going on under the hood that isn't immediately obvious from the HTML that we write. And making a custom element is very, very similar. When we come to write the HTML code for our element, we'll just put a very simple one line of HTML in, we'll see in a minute. But there's a lot more going on under the hood that won't ever be visible to the end user or even to someone having a look at the code of the website. So that we can just see the constructor there and how it's put together and where we've got the shadow root being attached. This is a very simplified example because you can't squish too much code on a slide, unfortunately, without it getting unreadable. We can take the code from our previous custom toggle button example, so we can put exactly the same JavaScript-driven functionality in to use the ARIA pressed attribute on our toggle button. And remember, all this is happening tucked away out of sight of all the code of the web page. So it's a much neater way from a coding point of view to use HTML with custom elements than to have to put all this into the HTML page itself or its associated documents. So So that's what we would put in our HTML. We would just open a toggle dash button element, put the word play in the middle, pretty much the same as we did with the button element. With custom elements, you have to have a hyphen or a dash in the middle of the name somewhere. It's the easy way to distinguish them from, quote, real HTML elements or not. But from a user's point of view, or at least from a developer's point of view, this is all the code we would need to put in our HTML page to produce our toggle button. So all of the JavaScript's hidden out of the way, as is most of the rest of the code. What will happen when a user comes along and uses this with a screen reader is something like this.
Play toggle.
Okay, it's not feeling like it. So essentially, it was very much like the custom button from before. It gets announced as a toggle button, and its state of pressed or not is announced. But from the implementation
Button not pressed. Pressed.
point,
Not.
Okay, let's go for it. From the implementation point as a developer, we've got much simpler code to write. And of course, we can reuse these custom elements as many times as we like across the website. All you ever have to do is just write the toggle button code in your HTML. There is a problem, though. All of the code that we wrote inside our custom element is hidden out of the way, much like it is for an audio or video element, except for the ARIA. If you go and run this in your browser and you go and then inspect the code, you'll still see the ARIA pressed attribute present on the toggle button, even though it was never actually applied by you in the HTML at all. And this is what's known as leaking HTML attributes. In this respect, it's perhaps not a major problem, but it does make for kind of untidiness. And developers, if nothing else, like tidy code. We like things that are nice and clean and orderly, with everything in its place and everything having a place. And so this leakage of accessibility information when we write custom elements is a bit irksome from a development point of view. And so we move on to the future, and work that is going on to try and solve the problem of ARIA leakage when we write custom elements, and also a potential solution to making it easier, perhaps more interesting for developers to be able to deal with the browser more directly in terms of the accessibility information. And it comes in the form of something known as the Accessibility Object Model. It's an experimental JavaScript API that's being developed by people from Apple, Google, and Mozilla. The GitHub URL is up on the screen, and I'm sorry I don't recall it to read it out, but it's being developed very much in the open. And I want you to bear that in mind as we go on through this, because commenting on standards like this that are developed at the W3C is incredibly important from all of us who has any occasion to think they might ever want to use these standards. It can't really be emphasized enough how useful it is for specification editors to hear from people who will ultimately be using the standards that they create, to make sure they're heading in the right direction, not doing anything crazy or unhelpful. So there are lots of phases to what's happening with the AOM. The first one is that you'll be able to use ARIA element and attribute reflection. This is also being featured in the ARIA 1.2 specification, so it's the thing we're most likely going to see has some browser support in the very near future. And it's quite a simple change, but it really simplifies the way we can set accessibility information using JavaScript. At the moment, what you have to do is write the kind of quite clumsy code, something like button.set attribute, and then give it the name of the attribute and the value of the attribute as arguments. Now, it's not a big problem. It's not too unwieldy. But again, developers like things neat and tidy. And what this phase of the AOM will let us do is use a more conventional, common JavaScript mode of doing things. So you'll be able to do something like button attribute name. So in this case, button.role equals, button.role maybe equals button. There's another example up on screen, which is button, as in the thing we want to apply the accessibility setting to, ARIA pressed equals true. You'll notice, if you're familiar with ARIA and recall the ARIA prefix that I was mentioning earlier, that in the AOM, all the dashes in the ARIA dash something attributes has vanished. So ARIA dash pressed becomes just ARIA pressed, one word. So that's a slight oddity in the change of the syntax. But this, in theory, will make it easier to write JavaScript that sets accessibility settings and has them recognized by the browser. So far, this is looking like a positive thing. Phase 1B will let authors, when they're particularly writing things like custom elements, set some accessibility characteristics at the time the custom element is created. And these are immutable. They're not going to be changeable. Once the element has actually been shown up in the browser, you won't be able to do anything to change the values that are set at this time. So this is much like the browser already provides all that accessibility information we saw at the start, things like the role and other bits and pieces. It will also be possible, though, to change some other accessibility characteristics in response to user interactions. So ARIA pressed is another good example of this. When a user presses a button, we want to be able to change the ARIA pressed state, and that's going to become a lot easier if this phase of the AOM goes ahead. Phase 2, there will be the opportunity to respond to new user events, things like increment and decrement, page scroll up, page scroll down. These are particularly being added in not so much for desktop use, but for mobile use. Being able to increment something or decrement something is an extremely common pattern on a touchscreen device, as is scrolling page up, page down. But there are no specific events to deal with this, and saying that we've got key down events and mouse click events and all sorts of other events now, these were missing, and so it's going to introduce some new events that we can respond to in our JavaScript. Phase 3 is where things really start to get interesting. I say interesting both in quotes and out of quotes. Interesting in the sense of quite exciting. It will let us add virtual accessibility information to the accessibility tree in the browser. Up until this point, the browser is the only thing that has been able to get its hands on the accessibility tree. This, for the first time, will give us as developers JavaScript access to that information and the ability to add new information into the accessibility tree. So it will be possible to add something into the accessibility tree that otherwise doesn't exist on the page itself. And this is where the interesting with quote marks comes in. On the one hand, this could be a horror story waiting to happen. We could very well end up with a time where there are two completely separate versions of a piece of content, one in the accessibility sense and one in the what everybody else gets sense. My personal thought is that if you've gone to the trouble of learning all your ARIA, all your accessibility, how all these mechanics work, you're probably not going to be the sort of person that's going to go down the route of developing two completely different and independent implementations of the same thing. I do think it might well have some uses, though. One of the things I really dislike, but still find necessary, is the need to use CSS to hide some information off screen, usually, for the benefit of screen reader users. It doesn't happen so often these days, but there are still use cases for doing that. The problem, of course, is that if you are someone who doesn't use the style sheets provided by the website, i.e. doesn't have the style sheets that hide that text out of everybody else's view, you're going to get all these peculiar little messages that mean absolutely nothing to you because you're a low vision person who just prefers a different set of style sheets. So it always feels a little bit hacky, a little bit dirty. With the AOM, if this phase comes into being, we could, for example, use it to provide those little snippets of information that are aimed very specifically at screen reader users without risking them getting in the way of anybody else's experience. And I think that has some merit. Phase 4 is the final phase of the AOM, and it will just really tie things up. One of the most interesting things is it will let, through JavaScript, it'll let us walk the entire accessibility tree. So we can do this with the DOM already, and in fact, we do it to find out how many elements of X variety there are on the page, and then we do some interaction based around that. This will enable us to do something very similar. So it would be possible to create quite screen reader-like functionality as part of the scripting for a web page. So if you wanted to add in some particular functionality, I'll use heading navigation as an existing example. By walking the accessibility tree, a screen reader is able to tell how many headings there are on the page and provide the user with the functionality to jump quickly from one to the next using a shortcut. With this ability to walk the accessibility tree using JavaScript, developers will effectively be able to create interactions, shortcuts, bits and pieces like that for themselves. And again, that could go either way. It could get really complicated, or it could be really useful. And the truth will be, if we get this far, it'll probably be a little from column A and a little from column B. Before I just finish up with some final thoughts on why we need to be a time traveler, there is one important thing I want to say about the AOM. Actually, two. One is that, as it stands at the moment, there isn't any browser support for any of this, not even behind the flag. As I said, it's very likely we will see browser support for the first, the attribute reflection, probably within the next few months, I should think. As for the rest of it, it's still very much a work in progress. And there are a lot of questions that the editors and the community working with them need to answer. And that's where input from people like yourselves becomes incredibly important. One of the biggest questions from my point of view is that of privacy, because there's a very interesting dilemma coming our way, well, coming my way, certainly, and that's that once we allow developers access to the accessibility tree, it gives them the ability to identify that the person using the website not only has a disability, but very specifically is a screen reader user. And that's because The browser doesn't create the accessibility tree unless it sees an assistive technology running. And now that might be any assistive technology, a screen reader, screen magnifier, or speech recognition tool. But the only assistive technology that really supports ARIA in any fashion is a screen reader. And that's what the accessibility object model is all about. It's a different way to use ARIA to change the accessibility tree. So we have a big question around how much of our privacy are we willing to sacrifice in order to be given an accessible experience? I'm pretty clear on that. I'm not willing to give away that much of my private information. I'll quite happily stand here and talk to you about being a blind person, but that's my choice to do that in the time and the place I see fit. I don't want every advertising person who has JavaScript and accessibility chops to be able to find out, amongst goodness knows what else they already seem to know about me, that I'm blind and I use a screen reader. That really, really makes me unhappy as a prospect. The editors of the AOM are very well aware of this, and they're trying really hard to find solutions, but it's a difficult problem. And this is where input from as many people as possible becomes incredibly important to try and answer these big and really quite difficult questions. But back to the talk, and why it's important to be a time traveler. Quite simply, we have a lot of good accessibility things we can call on. We have the native accessibility of HTML in the original sense. We have the ability to add in accessibility now with ARIA in many different versions. And as we move into an area where we get to be able to play a little bit more directly with the accessibility relationship between the browser and the website and the screen reader, we have even more exciting possibilities to call on. But if we don't take the best that we've got from the past and the present and the future, if we don't time travel a little bit with our accessibility, then we're really missing a trick, because none of these solutions in and of themselves, none of them in their own right, enable us to make the technologies that we want to create today as accessible as we need them to be. So thank you very much.
We'll now open it up for questions. So if anyone has a question, just raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone over to you.
Hey, Sean here.
Hey, everyone.
So in your presentation, you started off with HTML and how that worked and how screen readers worked, and kind of as each level of technology added on. But what ended up kind of happening is every time you add on another layer of technology, they're all kind of used in conjunction.
Mm-hmm.
So you have HTML, and then we get the ARIA on top. Now you have HTML and ARIA, and they interplay in different strange, sometimes wonderful ways. Now you have the AOM, which seems like it could also add a potential another layer that now you have HTML with ARIA with AOM kind of all mixing in. So how is that being taken into account with the design of AOM?
Sorry, with the design of?
AOM?
How much is the layering being taken into account?
Right, so there's different interplays between each of them as developers learn and unlearn the right ways to do it.
That's a very good question. So the editors do include people like Alex Boxall from Google, who are very well versed in accessibility. So they are thinking about the complexity. Like a lot of people who are very focused on trying to find a solution to a problem, it's perhaps true that they don't necessarily consider all of the angles, or haven't so far, and that's, again, brings me back to the point as to why it's important to hear from the likes of us who have to go away and use these things eventually. But I think the layering thing is interesting. I think it's almost like a transfer of power or a transfer of responsibilities. Back at the beginning, it was screen reader did its thing, the browser did its thing. Now what we're getting with the AOM is that we're throwing developer into that relationship as well. So what we used to have to rely on the browser or the screen reader to do, then the browser and the screen reader, now we can kind of inject ourselves into that process. And what's the phrase? With great power comes great responsibility. That remains to be seen, and as I said, I'm pretty sure we'll see a lot of good coming out of something like this if we can fix the big questions like privacy, but the complexity will almost certainly mean we end up with some pretty disastrous outcomes as well, I expect. That's what happened with ARIA, so it's...
Thank you. All right, next question.
is Thomas. I had a question on just the custom element concept, which currently exists in HTML. So if you built a custom element, right now the solution is you would add the ARIA attributes onto the sort of top level element, and that is removing the tidiness, but is still something possible? Or are there, like when you get into complex custom elements, not a way to actually make them accessible today?
No, it's more that when you are writing your custom element, when you're actually creating the hidden code part of it, if you use ARIA anywhere in that shadow element, or the shadow part of the custom element, it will show up in the rendered HTML of the page. Okay. So you don't have to apply the ARIA direct to your toggle button, as it was in my example. When you write toggle button into your code, just the fact that the ARIA attribute was used in the shadow DOM, the hidden away part of that element, means for the moment the browser will cough it up and add it to the HTML toggle button element, whether you like it or not. And that's where the messiness gets, because you've tried to contain everything else inside your custom element. So style sheets are contained, the behavior is contained, none of that sort of escapes outside of the element that you're trying to create, but the accessibility at the moment does leak out sideways, and that's the bit they're trying to solve. Right,
okay. And there are, I mean, as far as us as a community, you mentioned contributing or having comments onto the GitHub sort of working group. That's a place to add comments. Is there any other things as far as evangelizing to the browser manufacturers or letting them know, like, I mean, any recommendations on that?
So the GitHub repo is definitely the place to put your comments in. That's where they're paying attention, the people who are working on the spec. As I said, it's members of Apple, Mozilla, and Google, so browser vendors, who are writing this spec, because from their point of view, it solves this custom elements problem quite neatly, and Google particularly is very highly invested in custom elements with its Polymer web component library, so they really want to solve this. So to that extent, the browsers are pretty well involved already. What I don't think we have enough involvement from is our community. As I say, people who are going to ultimately be using this when it becomes supported. So yeah, the GitHub repo is definitely the place to ask questions. They're a really friendly bunch, the editors who work on this. Ask questions, they will try to help.
Great, thank you. Got a question up front.
I've got a silly question.
Last
time I had my code linted for accessibility, I got hit for having an emoticon in my code, and it said that's not accessible, remove it. So I was wondering if you had thoughts on emojis and emoticons inside of content.
As in a Unicode emoji?
Yeah,
type
more or
thing?
less like happy face or sad face instead of literally like some words in place. And I had some linting tools set up that would catch kind of all the low-hanging fruit, and that one was like, don't use it. And I was like, oh, that one just bummed me out.
So that's an interesting one. Actually, the Unicode emoji now are reasonably well supported, certainly by screen reader, different screen readers. Only the very newest, is it generation 5 or 6, I think, aren't terribly well supported. So now, as a rule, if you use one of those emoji in your code anywhere, the screen reader at least will recognize it. So I guess what it was being failed on was probably no accessible name. Something like that. If you want to take a very robust approach to it, the way to do it is a little bit hacky, but it does the trick. Wrap your emoji in a span, give the span a role of image, and then use ARIA label to give it an alternative text. And that should do the trick. If you come and find me after the talk, I blogged about this a little while ago. I can point you at an article.
All right, thank you.
About that, but yeah, that should do it.
Hi, Chuck. We've been doing a lot of development with accessibility development, coming across issues with reCAPTCHA. We're working with a company called A11yNYC, who's doing our audits, and they're like, well, it's the best thing out there, but it's still not great. So especially as a blind user, what's the frustration factor with reCAPTCHAs, or anything out there that you've noticed that is kind of better for you as a user, but still provides the security level needed for spam and
so version 3 of reCAPTCHA, which, if you're not familiar with the generations, actually doesn't require any user interaction at all things being equal, is not too bad as a first attempt. If you trip it, that's when it gets complicated, no matter what form, because then it will start asking you to, recognize pictures of things and other bits and pieces. And I saw a great tweet a couple of days ago, which is, am I the only one that finds it worrying that Google are developing self-driving cars and they're also the ones asking me to identify traffic lights by capture? And geniuses of the web in less than 160 characters. So yeah, reCAPTCHA 3, providing you don't trip it, is actually pretty unintrusive. It's intrusive in the sense that I still don't trust anything that recognizes I'm using a keyboard and possibly other bits and pieces, but perhaps that's just my sense of privacy. Going back a generation to reCAPTCHA 2, which is the one that asks you to check a box to confirm you're not a robot, I don't actually find those too problematic, providing I know they're there. That's usually the biggest catch for me. I tend to find I've submitted a form and only when it doesn't work do I notice there's a little message that says, convince me you're not a human. I'm not a typical screen reader user though, so I wouldn't necessarily take my word for the average experience. It's with the old school proper captures that of course you run into trouble, generally speaking. I don't know about anyone here and the visual ones, but I can never solve the audio ones. I can either understand what they're saying, but I can't get to the edit box fast enough to type them, or I can get to the edit box fast enough to type them, but I can't understand a word of what's being spoken to me. So it's kind of degrees of awful. I actually still have yet to be convinced that captures are necessary at all, but sadly it seems a lot of people still really believe they're the only way to stop bots. I think doing things like checking for frequency of form submission. So if someone's trying to bash an account registration or a login until they think they found a genuine email address or something like that, you can protect against that by checking for the frequency that the server's being pinged for a download of the page. So I think there are better ways we can solve this problem, but I'm not an expert in that field, and clearly a lot of people think otherwise. So yeah, reCAPTCHA 3 is probably your best bet at the moment if capture is absolutely necessary.
Thanks.
Thank you. Neo, I just want to follow up on the CAPTCHA because I do work with low vision and blind users. I also work in producing digital talking books and Braille, large print, etc. And I do have an experience that I would love to share because this just happened last week where I have a user who tried to use CAPTCHA. They're a low vision user. They tried to scale up on the screen. Everything got blurred. So they went to the audio version. And unfortunately, this user speaks multiple languages. So when you go to the audio version, you hear multiple languages. This person could understand all of them, except for the language that everybody was expecting, which was listen to the English side of the audio and fill in the blank with what was available, and timed out every single time because they would hear Arabic in the background, they would hear French in the background, and the users spoke these languages. Yeah. So it created more confusion and more of a barrier to access. Yeah. The other one that I do remember from a couple of years back was when Google would begin autofilling username and password fields. This user would go to, say, Gmail, try to log in, the field was already filled, but was never told that the username or the password field had already been filled in. So they were trying to type in their password on top of having their password already filled in, and they were being denied access. So I just wanted to share that experience.
Yeah, good examples.
So, my name's Jake. I have a question kind of more about, so we're looking at this from the approach of the markup, the HTML that we're producing to make things accessible. And I'm kind of curious what screen readers are doing to make what's being read out loud more predictable. And I'll give a very concrete example of something. I work with forms a lot, and very frustrating user experience I saw was I'll make up the combination I think was JAWS and Chrome or some combination of a screen reader and a browser. And there was a required field that was blank. And when you were using the screen reader and you toggled into the required field, it rambled off the label required and then said invalid, which is really jarring because it's not invalid. You just haven't proceeded to engage and enter something. Yep. And then if you switch over to a different screener, it read a totally it didn't have that problem. And I'm kind of wondering, are the screen reader companies trying to come together on some spec on what should be read out loud when you engage different elements? Similar to how CSS, they have really strict specs when they talk about as esoteric as a bulleted list, preceded by a paragraph, how it should handle margins, and they get crazy on those specs. And I feel like that's the other side of this. Like, what are they doing to improve the standard, which I feel like there isn't a standard?
They're not. is the short answer. ARIA as a spec, which I suspect maybe to cause what's causing the problem you just described in whichever screen reader it was. I see this as quite a common pattern, actually. People will put ARIA invalid equals true on an empty form field before anybody's got as far as filling anything in. And you're right, it is extremely jarring if that gets picked up. So it may be, if you look for that, you might solve the problem in the short term if you remove that until it's needed. To your larger question, though, no, the screen readers aren't working together to find any commonality. The one thing I would say, though, is most users don't switch from one screen reader to another, so they don't know about these differences. It's a bit like back in the days when we had a lot of browser differences in CSS, as you mentioned. I remember working with clients and like, but the logo's 5 pixels to the right in IE than wherever it is in Firefox, and people would get incredibly stressed by this. And you had to sort of point out, yeah, but most IE users aren't using Firefox, and most Firefox users aren't using IE, and providing it looks okay in both, everybody should be happy. And it's a bit like that with screen readers. It's very tempting when you test with a lot of different screen readers and a lot of different browsers to get very worried by discrepancy. Sometimes, perhaps like the one you've just described, they are more legitimate than some of the differences. But users are generally oblivious to these things, so they're just used to the experience they get from the one that they use most of the time. The other problem, of course, is it's not just the screen reader. It's so fundamentally wrapped up in what information is available from the browser, and that changes from one browser to another as well. So trying to find some consistency is pretty hard, unfortunately.
But so I kind of want to, because that's what I was taking away. I was looking at these quirks, lack of a better word, and I was going on the mindset that someone just gets used to that quirk. The first time they go to a form, it blurts out invalid on an empty field, and it's not. They move on. Yeah. Okay.
Well, eventually. Yes.
Eventually.
Yeah. To varying degrees, you do learn a degree of just obliviousness to it. Same with pronunciation. I get a lot of people who, how should I write content in a way that's accessible to screen readers? Write content in a way that's readable by everybody else, and leave us to ignore the peculiarities that our screen readers chuck our way. One thing I will say, though, if you do notice something, certainly for JAWS has an open issue tracker now on GitHub. If you come find me afterwards and give me some way of contacting you, I'll drop you a link, or you should be able to Google it. NVDA has an open issue tracker as well, so if there are things, it sounds like you picked up a JAWS Chrome bug there, it might be worth just checking that out and filing an issue there and seeing if you can get it fixed.
Hi, Leonie. This is Cameron.
Hey.
The conversation about screen readers and its nuances and quirks and inefficiencies, etc. I mean, it kind of dovetails with a lot of developments in voice assistants that we talked about earlier, and also with being able to augment content with the accessibility object model. Do you see these changes impacting the usage of screen readers as they stand? Do screen readers feel like a satisfactory solution to the problems that we're describing, and how do we do better, maybe in the context of voice assistants or maybe otherwise?
That's an interesting one. I don't think that voice assistants are going to replace screen readers on mobiles or laptops or whatever anytime soon, for the simple reason that voice interaction is very much in the here and now. You ask it a question, you get an answer. You maybe get given 2 or 3 options that you can choose from, and you can remember 2 or 3 options, and you choose one, and it goes on, down the conversational path. That's great for very simple one-track interactions, but a lot of the stuff that we do on the web on our desktops and laptops is a lot more complex. It involves being aware of maybe 2 or 3 pieces of information at different places on the same web page. If you're searching for a flight, for example, you might be filtering based on price or class of ticket or something like that. Trying to do that successfully at the moment through voice interaction for anyone is incredibly different, because the mode of conversation isn't actually particularly well suited to more complicated tasks, certainly not at the moment. That might change. I'm not sure we can do much to change how conversation works and how capable humans are at conversing, though. Conversations generally are quite simple one-track things. As to whether screen readers are the right solution, That's a good question. I often hear people say, if we were to do this all again today, we probably wouldn't create screen readers. But I don't think I've ever heard anybody say what they would create if they didn't. Whether that's because it's really hard to think of something in the way, because screen readers are just so big and so ubiquitous and so much there. It's like sometimes when you're staring at a wall you've painted blue and trying to think what it would look like if it was red. It's just really difficult. So I don't know, is the short answer to that. I suspect we could come up with an easier solution. Screen readers are difficult. But again, don't ask me. I really couldn't tell you what that might look like.
Okay, thank you.
So I worked at Opera on what we would create instead of screen readers, and that's a fairly convincing reason why we don't. But the general thing of, what should we tell people about when not to interfere with what screen readers do? And the same thing. I mean, again, an example from Opera. Opera had navigation like screen readers now have when screen readers didn't have it, and it was fantastic. But not everyone has that. So how do we deal with that piece of, some people are actually still living in the past with technology that's not quite up to date? And how do we deal with we have a great way of adding things with the accessibility model. Should we add them, and are they actually going to help, or are they going to get in the way?
They may well get in the way for all the reasons that I said in the talk. The interesting thing about the accessibility model is that actually from the consumer point of view, from the screen reader's point of view, it changes nothing. It still gets the information from the browser in exactly the way it has done for the past 15 years, and will more or less do exactly the same thing it has always done with it. So that part of the relationship won't change at all. So in terms of catching up from what technology you've got, what browser you've got, or whatever, your browser is probably the only really important piece of that puzzle. The screen reader, providing it's set up just to ask the browser for information, will have some success in doing it. I mean, so there was a very early version of the AOM that did have some support in browsers, and certainly the screen readers I tested in Mac and Mac VoiceOver, NVDA, and JAWS picked up the new stuff that I'd created without batting an eyelid. So there is hope that the legacy technology thing won't be quite so much of a problem in this case. As for the rest of it, all hell could break loose quite rapidly. So we'll see.
Hey, my name is Nick.
Hey.
For the past 10 years, we've been working with this kind of ideology of mobile first, and not only does it affect the way we think, but it also affects kind of our workflow as well. Do you envision AOM being a new workflow where it's kind of accessibility first, and is that something that we can work on first and then work on these other layers that we talk about, the complexity of these multiple layers?
I think it has to work in tandem with whichever first happens to be flavor of the month at the time. So you can't separate the presentation of the content from its accessibility. So if you're thinking mobile first and you need to create something custom, you've got to make sure that's accessible. If the IOM gives you a way to do that, you've got to tie the two together from the very beginning. Same if you take a back step in, for people still doing kind of desktop, whatever first. If I have to put a first, actually I'd make it content first, and then hook everything else around it. But we have a number of whatever's first choices to make, and from a code point of view, mobile first is still incredibly popular. You can't separate it from the accessibility, really. If one happens without the other, then you're going to run into problems. Cool.
Any other questions? All right. Well, I think we'd just like to say thank you again very much to Léonie. This is awesome talk.
Thank you very much. If you have any other questions, come and find me afterwards, or my contact info is up on the last screen, and I'll share the slides on Twitter in a moment. So please ask me questions anytime this evening or ahead.
And I'd like to just plug her website, tink.uk. There, I've been reading Léonie's posts, for many, many years, and it's always on like some of the latest, technologies that are coming out. There's really interesting thoughts there, much like we had tonight. But I would say, there's a whole history of awesome articles on that site. So definitely check that out. Again, want to thank everyone for coming tonight. Thank our event sponsors of ThoughtBot, the Internet Society of New York, and the Accessibility Special Interest Group, Mirror by Night from White Coat Captioning, Level Access, and Adobe. We really appreciate being able to have this event every month and have it accessible. As always, if you're interested in communicating about another event or another accessibility-related piece of information, if you have job opportunities or other events, we have Tanya now in the back here as our volunteer, but we want to start putting those more out into the community and helping people that are part of our community learn about other events that are happening in the city. So feel free to get her contact information. We'll be also posting that on our Meetup site. With that being said, also if you're looking for presentations, also reach out to us. We're always looking to get scheduled ahead. We won't be having an event in February due to having 2 in January, but our next event will be in March. And Cameron, Scott?
We have a new email address. It's hello@A11yNYC. hello@A11yNYC. So if you need to reach us, you can email that email address, and it'll go out to the organizers, and you'll be able to act on that. .com. A11yNYC.com. Yeah. And for the job postings, for events, for ideas, for questions, you can message us there, and we'll be able to get back to you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good night.
Great. Thank you.
We have some time in the space, so if you want to have conversation.